Hi, in this video I'm going to teach you how to make a single welt lapel pocket. So this is a pocket that goes on the left side of your jacket front. It is at a slight angle to that of the center grain line of the garment piece. And so let's get started. So you're going to need pieces number 1, your jacket front, number 19, your welt, number 20, your welt reinforcement, number 21, your welt pocketing bag, and number 22, your welt woven iron-on interfacing. Do take note to make sure you cut this from the right side of the garment up and mark your grain line, because it will help you remember which way things are going to be going later. Your welt reinforcement piece, if you do not interface this side of your garment, you will need some sort of reinforcement on the back of your garment. So I did a sew-in where I basted it in place, that's piece number 20, and then I did my thread tracing across my line. So I just took my pattern and I placed this on top after I put that piece on, marked my circle placement, connected it, and did thread traced it all the way through so I can see this line from here to here, and I have my tailor tacks at either end. So this is my placement line, and then this is the basted welt reinforcement. Okay. So if you choose to interface this piece though, like speed tailoring technique shows us, then you do not need to add this piece because it will already have interfacing in this area. Okay, the first step after basting and marking this is going to be attaching your welt or your interfacing to your welt. So make sure again that you're cutting this with the glue side up so that it can attach to the back side of this piece like so. You'll want to center it there because this is indicating your seam allowance lines all the way around. So let's do that now. Making sure that your iron is set to the right temperature for your interfacing, that you have covered your ironing mat with some sort of cloth. I like to label mine so that I know which side to place up so I don't get glue on my ironing board. I'm going to use a little bit of moisture and cover my piece. Again, you just want to make sure everything's centered, and then firm pressure with a little steam for the right amount of time. So my interfacing is a wool setting with 10 to 15 seconds of pressure with moisture. So I'm just going to hold that on. And then you'll see that it is stuck on there, and then we're ready to sew that to our pocketing. The next step is to take your pocketing bag, and so I'm just going to take the wrong side of one piece, and I'm going to take my welt and I'm going to flip this over. So again, I just want to point out that my green line arrow points down, so if I flip this over this way, my green line arrow is still pointing down. So you can flip it like the pages of a book, don't flip it upside down. Okay, so I'm going to flip this up or over so you can see the back side, and I'm going to place this on, since I've already applied my interfacing, right onto the top. This pocketing bag is angled at the top because again we're going to have our pocket angled, and I'm going to center that on either side here and here and pin it in place. Then I'm going to sew it just above my interfacing, stopping just at the point corner here and here, making sure I reinforce those two sides really well. Okay, so right here, I'm just going to place this into the machine. I'm going to start actually a little bit in and backstitch to my corner. I just like to do that because it's a little bit less shifty and it gives me less things to rip out if I should make a mistake. So I'm going to backstitch to the corner of the interfacing, and then I'm going to stitch forward right on at a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Go right to my corner and backstitch again. Just like 3 to 5 stitches. Don't go crazy on your back stitches, otherwise you're going to be ripping out a lot of back stitches when you make mistakes. And it's harder to keep it in control. It looks sloppy. Okay, so I'm going to fold this up on that line and then back down, reversing it like this so that I can stitch down and across. So I want, oh, we forgot to mark our stitching line on the other side, so let's do that really quick. So on my welt iron on interfacing, I have a stitching line here. Since I can't see it from the other side, I'm just going to use my notcher to notch that out. You could also use a pair of scissors. That way I can place this on top of my interfacing and mark it. Just gonna mark a line there, and a line there. And then I'm going to connect those two lines. Two marks. A marker like that. And then that way when I flip this up and fold this down, I know exactly where I'm sewing to. Now you can thread trace this if you like, but I'm just going to leave it. Now this side is going to become the side that shows on the outside right here. So this is the side that I want ever so slightly bigger than the inside piece. So I'm going to push it, like squeeze it in just a little bit, which will give me just a little bit more room when I stitch this down. And the same thing on this side. I'm just going to squeeze it in just a little bit, so just a little bit of that back piece is showing. And then I'm going to stitch down both sides of this right next to the interfacing here and here, stopping exactly at that stitching line. I don't want to sew into the pocketing from the other side, okay? And I don't want to cross this line. So just give yourself just a little bit of a bubble there to make this piece slightly bigger. Back at the sewing machine, I'm just going to sew right on the edge of that interfacing. I'm going to back stitch really well at the fold, and then just stitch straight down and stopping exactly on my line. So I'm just a little short of my line, so I'm going to reduce my stitch length and take a tiny stitch. And then I'll increase that back up. And I'm doing this all at 2.5 millimeter stitch length, just because that's a little stronger than what I usually do, which is 3 millimeters. Because I have that guide as my interfacing as my guide, I can go ahead and place my fabric to the inside here. Some machines have a gauge here as well that you can use for your seam allowance, but because I'm sewing right on the edge, I don't really need it. Okay, so you're going to be clipping the corners. So when you clip these corners, you want to make sure you leave at least 1/8 of an inch up here so you don't end up having a hole in your corners. So again, I'm just going to leave 1/8 of an inch, and then we're going to take this to the iron and press this seam open and flat. So just like this. Finger in there and like this. Okay, so let's take that to the iron. So we're at the ironing board, and I'm just going to put this on my point press. If you don't have a point press, you can just use the tip of your iron on your ironing board just to press that corner open. So just vary a little bit because you don't want to add wrinkles or creases where you don't want them. So I'm just going to press that right open. And then I'm going to just place my finger right on the corner there. Now what usually makes these corners not look good when they're turned is that the seam allowance is all folded and bulky and crunched up in there. So if your seam allowance is flat, your corner should look great. If your seam allowance is bunched up, your corner is going to look bunched up. So if you have trouble getting these little tips out, you can use a plastic tool or like a wooden dowel, like a chopstick or something, to flatten that out, or poke that out. Don't use a seam ripper, don't use scissors, because you're just going to cut a hole right through. Now this is going to be the right side of my welt here, and this will be the wrong side where I've sewn it down. Okay, so I'm going to just give that a press right here. And then that will allow me to sew this onto my jacket front. So just before we get to putting this on the jacket, I forgot one more step. So we just want to cut this seam allowance of your pocketing. So right to your stitching line from where we sewed this on and here. So you just want this little piece to be able to get up out of the way. And so I'm just going to cut right up to there, because what we want is, I'm just angle this little wedge in here, and the same thing on this side. I'm going to angle this a little wedge out here, because we're going to take this seam allowance from the pocketing and the welt. I'm just going to trim that little corner down, and we're going to trim this corner too. We're going to shove that inside our welt, so we don't want any of this to be in the way. So I've trimmed this corner here, trimmed off the same thing on the pocketing, and we're going to stick that inside. So this becomes like a little extra reinforcement for your welt, and it leaves us only with the seam allowance that we're going to be sewing our welt to the jacket and our pocketing. Okay, so I have mine like this on the front, and it should look like this on the back, or if I stick up those little pieces like this. Okay, I'm just going to give that a quick iron. Again, making sure don't press too firmly, especially if you have delicate fabric, and use a press cloth, otherwise you can damage your fabric by getting iron shine. So what I just did would guarantee make that damaged on a delicate fabric. So, okay, so it should now look like this on the back and like this on the front. So now we're going to place this upside down on our jacket front and sew right across our line here. Again, this is your front of your welt, back of your welt. You're going to have already clipped that and tucked in your seam allowances. And then we're going to take this, and so we have our jacket front here with our marked placement line. We're going to place this exactly on that placement line so that we can stitch across. So tuck, we don't want to catch any of your pocketing when we stitch this, so we want to make sure that we have this well positioned and everything is out of the way. So I'm looking for that tailor tack there. I'm placing this edge of my welt exactly on that tailor tack on this corner and pinning it down, and exactly on my tailor tack on this side. So looks like my placement line is just a tiny bit smaller than my welt, so maybe I didn't sew I should have probably sewn this with 1/2-inch seam allowances on the sides. It looks like I'm about an 1/8 inch big, so I'm going to let it go towards the armhole a little bit more than it should have. Okay, so I'm going to stitch right across the top here just to make sure I have a good sense of where I'm stitching. I'm going to just mark my stitching line on this side as well. Okay, I'm at the machine and I just want to show, I pulled out the seam allowance again just so I can see it better. And I've made sure my seam allowance on the welt front is flat and smooth. And I've marked my stitching line. Okay, I've pinned it really well. I'm going to line this up into the machine. Again, I'm going to back stitch first. So I'm just going to start with my needle down. And then I'm going to back stitch to the edge, right up off, like just right at the edge, and then across, just making sure that I'm not catching my pocketing or the back of the welt, and sewing this on the front side of the jacket. And I'm going to sew right to the corner. And in this case, I am going over my pins, but do be careful because your machine and your needles don't like that. Neither do the pens. And I'm just a little short of the edge, so I reduce my stitch length down for that last stitch, and then I put it back up to 2.5. And I'm going to take a few extra stitches back and take that out. Okay, so I've stitched across there. I'm just going to clip my threads so that I don't have them showing later. Okay, and then again I can tuck this inside which allows me to see my stitching a little better. And then I'm going to trim these little bits that are sticking out. And then we will be able to slice and flip this to the inside after we do our next step. So your next step is to place your second piece of pocketing in position so that we can sew it onto the front of the jacket. So I'm going to tuck that in underneath my welt seam allowance, okay? And I just want to make sure that when I line this up, that when I go to fold this together, that it will line up. Now, I have a little bit of extra because I am using less seam allowance on this piece of pocketing at the moment, but we're going to just stitch across here just above our stitching line, or our seam allowance line here. So I want to note that we stitched our welt right to here, and I'm just going to mark that on my pocketing, okay, and right under here, so right there. When I put this on, or when I sew this to this, and I'm going to stitch just above the seam allowance like I mentioned, I'm going to make this stitching line just 1/8 of an inch smaller than this here. So I actually want to start here and here. That way when I do flip my welt up and through the pocketing through the hole, I have something to sew it to instead of just a hole. So we're going to do that now. So I'm just going to make sure, like, try to get that in as tight as you can to where the welt's been sewn on to the jacket front, and then you'll just stitch right on the edge of that line, and that will become the top half of the opening. Since it's really hard for me to back stitch and get precision on my starting and stopping point, I'm going to reduce my stitch length down to as small as possible and do 3 stitches in place, which is also known as a lock stitch. Okay, so I'll do 3 stitches, or 4. Increase my length to 2.5 again, and then go to the end, and then I'll stop that 1/8 of an inch short. So because my seam allowance is just ever so slightly smaller on this end, I'm actually using my previous stitching line and the edge of my foot as my guide so that I'm keeping this straight. And then here, one more stitch, and I could back stitch or do a lock stitch again. So I'm going to choose to back stitch. It's okay to go a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch from the edge, but don't go less. We want to make sure we have that gap. Okay, so it should look like this, and then that top one should just be a little bit short of the bottom one. So this one, yeah, it is hard to see because of the there, but you can see that that's a little short from there. Okay, and then that will just slice down here. Now when you cut down here, you want to make sure that you are going to be cutting exactly down the center of your piece, and then angling at the corners and cutting exactly to the points. If you cut past, you'll have a hole. If you don't cut far enough, you'll have a pucker. So you have to cut exactly to that last stitch and make sure that you're using nice and sharp scissors. Otherwise they'll slip and they won't grab the fabric very nice. Now I have all these thread tacks in here now, and I'm going to, now that I've used them all, I'm going to take all of this out. Those out. Okay, so I've gotten all my thread ticks out and trimmed my threads. I also took out the basting around my reinforcement piece. You aren't trimming your reinforcement piece down because if you're putting canvas on here, you'll use that to secure the two together or attach the two together. And then this is what it should be looking like on the front right now. So you have your two pieces of pocketing. You're going to be cutting a hole right in the middle and cutting to your corners. Don't cut your seam allowance when you're cutting your triangles. Just cut, or your center line, just cut your front, the jacket front, to make that hole go through. Okay, so I marked my center. So I ironed off my previous markings and I marked my center cutting line. So this is going to be through the reinforcement and through the jacket only, no seam allowances, no pocketing. I've marked my triangle cutting lines. I like to start at least 1/2 inch in from this bottom line and then angle out, so or in. So I'm just going to take my scissors, and I'm feeling that I'm not cutting anything else, right? I'm going to place, open that up so that I don't have anything underneath, and put just a little snip into my reinforcement and my jacket so I can get the point of my scissors through. Now these are serrated scissors, so they do help me grab the fabric a little better. And again, I don't want to catch anything else, so I'm just going to make sure it's all out of the way. I'm going to cut to my first corner and then cut only to my stitching line, okay? And then again, only to my stitching line, the end of my stitching line. So even there where I have like just the tiniest bit not cut can cause a problem. Okay. So don't rush this. Take your time, cut precisely. Otherwise, you're gonna have to be fixing things or possibly redoing things. Now we get to finally put our pocketing into our hole. And you can get an idea of how it's going to look. So right like that. So there. Flip that over. And then it should look like this on the first layer. That's what it's going to be like when it's finished. And then this will be the inside of the pocket. So you're going to want to bring those triangles, make sure they come through. We don't want to leave them on the right side of the fabric. And then that is the inside piece. So again, that seam allowance is going to be tucked into the pocketing. Seam allowance is going to be tucked inside the welt there. And now is when you would want to do a stitch in the ditch without catching your upper pocketing. So you'll fold that out of the way and you'll press this and then just do a stitch in the ditch right on the edge here, and that's going to secure your welt, your seam allowance, and your pocketing of the lower half all together. So I'm going to take this to iron first and press it. Okay, so I'm on the wrong side of my jacket. I have my one piece of pocketing folded down. That way I can really push that seam allowance up, because if I flip it up to do it, the seam allowance just doesn't want to go where it needs to go. And it's going to be like this, so we want to make sure that that's how we get it pressed. So don't accidentally press any creases into your garment, so be really careful about all these pieces on the side, that you're not forming creases in them. And then just use the steam to soften the fabric, and then about 10 seconds to dry it out. Okay. And then, like I mentioned, you're going to take this and on the right side, just stitch in the ditch right across there. And that will form a nice little bottom edge. Okay, so stitching in the ditch is when I don't stitch on top of the jacket. I'm going to stitch on the welt itself, and so I want to make sure that I'm stitching right where this is sewn before, and then a little back stitch right at the corner, and then across. And I'm not catching my upper pocketing. This is only the lower pocketing underneath, and my welt and my front jacket, but I'm not sewing on the front of the jacket. I'm just sewing. Might have accidentally caught my upper pocket, and I did, so I'm going to take that out. Okay, so that was a false alarm. There was actually, it was free. It just looked like it was caught. So I'm just going to overlap my stitches a little bit, do one little back stitch, and then it shouldn't show that I stopped and started again right there. And go right to the end. So with a smaller stitch, I'm going to just take just a couple of tiny stitches right to the end, and then back, which almost looks like a lock stitch because I'm just at 1 millimeter stitch length. Alright, so I'm going to trim my threads on the front first, which is going to leave tiny little tails, but now if I go to the back and pull those threads before I cut them, it should pull the little tails to the back. So you won't see them on the front. Right. So that is your stitch in the ditch. So it should pretty much be like not visible at all. You can edge stitch this, so stitch right on the edge of your jacket front. That is another way of doing this. Okay. So this now, the pocketing. So I just want to show you what I did. So I just did that little stitch right there, closing up the hole that was going into our welt before. So now that seam allowance is inside and stuck there where we want it to be. And then we have to deal with these triangles. and stitch the pocket bag closed. So it will be lined up like this and sewn across. So we'll do those steps next. Okay, so the next step is going to be to secure or to sew your pocket bag together. And so I'm just going to show you where we're doing that. So we're going to stitch across or down and around the pocket bag. And so your triangle should be pulled to the inside so that you'll stitch as close as you can right next to those and on either side. So you're going to do all 3 of these layers together. So the triangles and the 2 pocket bag pieces. And then I'm going to angle out. So I can go straight out like this, or I can angle like this. It doesn't really matter because you're not going to be putting anything in this pocket that you need this space up here. So you can go at an angle like this if you want. And then just make sure your pocket bag pieces are together. And then giving yourself at least a 1/4 inch seam allowance up to 1/2 inch is what we originally added to the bag. The smaller seam allowance on your pockets, the bigger your pockets. And I want to just make sure that my pocket lining piece here is just a little bit smaller than this one, so I'm going to give myself just a little bit of extra on that piece, and then this last piece. So this is how I'm going to be sewing the bag. Just down, pivoting, 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 and then up. Just make sure you're back stitching well here and here to catch those triangles. And you can pin this in place. You could even sew it from the other side, whatever is easier for you. I just like to mark it because otherwise I find that my stitches look a little wonky. So I flipped this over and I decided that because I can see my triangles a little better, I marked this side instead. So I'll actually start sewing underneath this reinforcement piece. So I'm going to pull the fashion fabric and this reinforcement piece, like the front of the jacket and the reinforcement piece, out of the way. And I'm just going to sew right over that triangle across and down, and then repeat, like go around, pivoting at each corner, and then go across my triangle and backstitch. So just to recap, we are going to be going over this triangle. I folded the reinforcement and the front out of the way. I have my 2 pocketing pieces and the triangle I'm going to go over. And I just want to make sure that, I backstitch really well at the triangle. So I'm just using my needle threader and have to catch that loop. All right, so I'm going to increase back up to my 2.5 stitch length and backstitch. So I might have just caught my front, which is going to show as a pucker, so we'll see when we get around and turn it right side out. All right, and I'm just going to do a little bit more of that triangle and then across my pocketing. I'm going to just keep folding that front out of my way. And then what I mean by pivot is when I get to my corner, needle down, lift your pressure foot, rotate your fabric so you can continue sewing down your line, lower your pressure foot, and keep going. Stopping at my corner, needle down, lift your foot, pressure foot, lower your foot. So I'm actually a stitch short. And then continue. So the camera's a little in my way, so I went off my line, but it is the pocketing, so it just means that it'll be a little bit bigger bag. And you can finish this, but usually it's not finished. Just make sure you lower that foot back down, otherwise you're going to have a mess. needle down, lift foot, lower foot, turn, lower foot. And then this one, I need to get all of this out of my way. So the garment out of the way, the reinforcement out of the way. I need to be able to find that other triangle. Just right there. I'm going to sew right up and over it. Okay, and then back stitch. And then doesn't look too bad. When I iron off that marker, you won't even notice that I went off track. Okay, so I've sewn my pocketing to each other, and the triangles are now reinforced and down. So I now have a complete little opening. Well, it's not complete, but my bag is closed, and then now I will either choose to bar tack these down. So that would be like I showed you on the half scale mini at the beginning. So this is bar tack, or not bar tack, but edge stitch down. So it's sewn right on the edge of that opening here and here. So that's why we have to have that opening just a little bit narrower at the top, so we have something to sew it onto. Or you can whip stitch this closed. So here's another sample where I've whip stitched the edges closed. So I've gone through all the layers all the way to the front, catching that welt on from the back side, so you don't see any stitches there. Or you can slip stitch it, and I'm going to show that one. Okay, so I'm choosing to slip stitch this welt to the jacket. So a few things about hand sewing. Don't cut your thread too long. You're going to spend more time untangling it than anything else. If you have some beeswax, run your thread through the beeswax and then through the iron. That will smooth any fuzzy fibers out, and you'll have less tangling. Make a knot, and you're doing a single layer of thread. So I'm not doubling my thread. I only have a single layer here. And try to keep the other end of your tail, which I don't know if you can see with this thread and lighting, but so I have my needle up here, my knot down here, not too long, and then my tail, the end of my tail is halfway between my needle and my knot. And if I keep it halfway the entire time I'm sewing, I'll neither pull my thread out of my needle, nor will I end up accidentally doubling up my thread as I'm sewing. The other thing to get used to if you're doing a lot of hand sewing is to wear a thimble. And so I want to come in from the back through my jacket fabric, and making sure that it's not going to be seen. So a slip stitch is also called a ladder stitch. And so I'm coming up through the corner, right through the corner of the jacket here, right at the base of my welt. Okay, then I'm just going to pull that. So this is called a stopper knot because it stops it from pulling through. And so I have my stopper knot pulled snug to the fabric, and then I'm going to go in. So I came out here, I'm going to go in right next to it. Okay, and then go along the fold of the welt, one stitch length, so one machine stitch length, which is about 3 millimeters. I'm going to run my needle in and out of the fold, and then this back in to the jacket fabric, parallel with that welt seam, and about 3 millimeters again, because it's about a stitch length. And then I'm going to come straight across. So the whole idea of this is we don't want the stitches to show. So if I come straight across and don't go at an angle, so you can see I have 2 little stitches there, and this is called a ladder stitch because if you do enough of them back and forth like this, And you can go through your reinforcement piece in the back. So if I do enough of them, they look like the rungs of a ladder. And then if you pull it snug, they disappear. So it looks like you machine stitched this, but you didn't. But the key is to go exactly across from where you came out and go back in there again. So imagine a line going vertically with little dots going horizontally or going across from each other, like on either side, and you're going to go in and out of those. Okay, so I've gotten almost to the top, so if you can see that, and if I just pull everything snug, it all disappears. Now I'm just going to go from the garment back into my pocket the other direction, and I want to be mindful of where I go in and out here. Basically want to go in and out, in right at the corner and out where I did my last stitch. And I'm going to again pull that snug so everything disappears. And then I'm going to go in and out of my garment back up. So I'm just doing basically a back stitch. I'm going in and out here. Sorry, I don't know if I'm getting this in. 2 times just to make sure it's really secure. And then I can go through to the back and secure this on the back side with a knot. So I'm just gonna take a tiny little stitch. Don't go all the way through. You don't want this to show. And make a loop. And then most people don't realize that if I just go through this isn't really going to make a knot. So come in from the back side of that loop and that will make a knot. And then repeat. Go through, just make sure you're not showing. Go through your loop from the back side or twist it. It's that twist that actually makes the knot. And then I'm just going to go through one more time and then cut my thread. And then I'll repeat that on the other side of my welt. So this side is secure. So again, I'm going to make a knot, single layer of thread, making sure that the end of my thread, so my needles, knots here, needles here, and then halfway, so knot here, needle here, halfway is my tail. I'm going to come in from the back side through all layers is fine, as long as you're not sewing your welt or your pocketing up and at an awkward angle. And I'm going to come in, so this time I'm going to come in through the welt. Right on the edge of the fold, if I can. Oh, it's very many layers there, many layers. So, sometimes this is when the thimble really comes in handy. You really have to push it through. There we go. Okay. And I want to pull it up and close it on this side. So I'm going to just make sure that it's all lined up, and then I'm going from the welt to through the garment. And then with about a 3 millimeter stitch, and then from the garment into the welt with a 3 millimeter stitch. And it's okay if your stitches show a little bit at the beginning. You're going to pull those tight later. So when you do about 3, just pull it all tight and it should disappear. Just make sure everything's looking okay on the back. So again, straight across into my welt. About a 3 millimeter stitch. And back into my jacket. coming out, so it'll be lined up with the corner. I'm going to flip this over so I can get to the everything. So I'm going to pull that all a little bit snug and go into the corner of my welt and out where I came before. So this is like a back stitch into my jacket and out of the jacket into the welt and out of the welt, and then straight through into the jacket right below. So that's how it looks. So on the front, and then I'm gonna see where I came out and make a little, catch the fabric, but not all the way through to the right side of the jacket. Making that loop, going in from the back side of my loop through, and repeat. And then one more time through, and then cut. Okay, so now this is the wrong side of your pocket and the right side of your pocket. Okay, so then we can add our canvas and start pad stitching. So you have your little pocket, and then often when you do a pocket, it is basted shut until the garment's done. So I'm just gonna take this and I'm just going to whip stitch this closed. So no knot, just an extra little stitch at the beginning. That makes it easy to take out later. Oops, I just accidentally undid my stitch. So and then two stitches at the end, just to like a back stitch. Okay. And then clip, and then that just keeps it closed until everything is secure back here, because we're going to use this to secure it to your canvas. Okay, so that is your welt pocket. So a single welt pocket. So we have one with tops or edge stitching. So you could also do a bar tack, which is a tiny little zigzag. Whip stitched, slip stitched, and then this one's been whip stitched from the inside. So there are your three welt pockets.